This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com.
Alpha Natural Resources. Consistent with its Running Right process, Alpha is an energy company committed to being a leader in mine safety and an environmental steward. We fuel progress around the world. More information at alphanr.com.
Haley Buick GMC, the place for a new Verano or terrain Denali, on Midlothian Turnpike in Richmond and online at haleybuickgmc.com. Taking it to the streets and helping our community. Intelligent Illuminations. We make streetlights smart and give you control, providing secure point-to-point wireless solutions for roadway and area lighting, helping you manage, monitor, and control your streetlights. More information at ilooms.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. Information at vachamber.com.
It's amazing what my students with special needs can accomplish. Their pride is priceless. That's why I teach.
Brought to you by the Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond, and a very special welcome to Charles Judd, the immediate past chair of the State Board of Elections. You've finished your term, or sentence, I guess, either way you want to consider it. And appreciate your being on This Week in Richmond to alert our viewers to some of the election issues. Now that you're out of that position, but what are some of the election issues that are still before the General Assembly here in the month of February as they are approaching ending the session? What's out there that's alive, and then there may be some that died that you want to mention as well.
Yeah, that's correct, David. A number of issues. In fact, the count was about 120 bills that were introduced that somehow affected elections in Virginia. Yes. But when you distill that down, some were kind of housekeeping,
right,
and some were making changes, and a number of them did not make it, were not ready for prime time. But the ones I think that folks have been made aware of, and of course the big one has been the discussion on replacing the voting machines in Virginia. And I think it's no secret to a lot of folks, the machines that are used in a big part of the state are older sometimes than the people voting on them. And as a result, they're failing. Right. And the technology has moved on. These machines are no longer supported, and you can't buy parts and so forth and so on. But the real big issue is the need to have a paper trail, and the total electronic machines do not do that. So what the state's moving toward is a digital scan machine. There are 3 certified vendors in Virginia, soon to be 4, I understand, that are certified by the State Board. And then the localities can pick which vendor they want to use, but the technology is all the same. It may look different, be a different color, but the technology is the same. So that's the uniformity that's needed. Now,
and that's an issue that's been out there.
That's been talked about, and I think on the front page on a few papers around the state, the governor is taking it very seriously, because he said just in fact yesterday that when he went to vote, he was on a touch screen and he had to vote. He had to push that button 12 times because it kept voting for the other candidate.
Wow. And
he made a point of saying that he voted for Mark Warner, but it kept registering his vote for the Libertarian candidate. So he had a first-hand experience that made him very sensitive to the issue.
Yes.
And so he really wants to see those machines replaced from that personal experience. And so does the State Board. We really need to get that technology up to date, foolproof, longer life, and paper trail. The paper trail is important for a recount. If there is a malfunction, and some machines do malfunction, then you have that paper trail as a check and balance for that.
Speaking of a paper trail, I
Paper
think
trail
we've got
ended up on the
one
floor.
that has slipped down there. If you need to get those,
I do need to get it.
You go right ahead. And
can
while
leave the
you're
other one there.
retrieving them, my understanding is that the governor's proposed this in his budget, and so localities, if this prevails, localities wouldn't be out the expense then
That's
of those,
correct.
of those machines.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
So-
The governor proposes a single vendor solution and all state money. He proposed $28 million, 25 for machines, and 25 million, and $3 million for electronic poll books, and a website that's a little more robust and a little more dependable for determining the results. All state money, I think there's been some feeling in the General Assembly that that's really a local responsibility, and that the localities should actually fund it as they have in the past. There's also some concern about a single vendor solution. I happen to feel that that's not the best, that you should have competition is good. My wife told me one time, anybody who knows how to shop knows the value of competition. And so to have more than one vendor to where the incentive is in the proper place for keeping it current, R&D, that kind of thing, is probably a better solution. But all that said, we really need to replace the voting equipment in Virginia sooner rather than later.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that one. Now, there's some other bills, some that concern maybe people who have gray hairs.
Well, that's true, and the one that you're talking to now has a favorite that I hope has be able to get some traction, and that is a proposal to allow voters 65 and older to vote absentee, no excuse. As you know now, there are 11 excuses. You have to pick one if you want to vote absentee before Election Day. But for voters 65 and older to be able to vote no excuse with a photo ID. You see, until we had photo ID, which took effect just this past election, there was concern about early voting, as some would call it, and so you needed an excuse. I'm going to be out of town for whatever reason. Now with photo ID, it's very, very difficult for there to be voter fraud with in-person voting. I use this gesture a lot because I think, okay, here's a photo ID, that picture matches this, so clearly I am who I say I am, and that takes away that chance for voter fraud. Now, 65 and older, and I'm in that category, I'll admit it, and in fact proud of it. I worked real hard for all of these grades, but that's 20% of the registered voters in Virginia are 65 and older. So think if you give them an opportunity to vote absentee before Election Day, how you can affect the long lines on Election Day. The localities like it because of that very reason. They're already in place to receive in-person absentee with excuse, but if you take that away from that age group, allow them to vote in person, I think it would have a real positive effect on our elections in Virginia.
It probably would eliminate some of the need for the people to go out to a vehicle where someone is sitting and waiting, which is provided. It's the service that's provided, because probably some of the people in wheelchairs and all would come in and would vote early if they could do it.
It would be a lot easier to do it before Election Day, simply because of the crowds on Election Day. So yeah, I think that's a good point as well.
Okay, what's
there's another bill that has had some discussion, and I think it's had some reporting around the state. This Board of Elections the state board began cooperating with 21 other states around the country to it has the nickname cross-check. We compare our database with those other databases. And the reason for that is to see if someone moves out of Virginia into another state and they register to vote there as an election is coming up. Sometimes, and the way the process is supposed to work is that new registrar notifies the registrar in Virginia. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes folks move out of state and all the other documentation shows that they're out of state, and yet they're still registered here. So when we compare that with other states, we see a number of folks. In fact, on the first run, David, there were 300,000 people in our voter database in Virginia who had moved to another state. And I dropped my papers again, I think I did. So, and when you distill that down, we found that because of some duplication and so forth. But what happens then is that if Virginia is notified that they have registered in another state, Virginia sends that voter a letter to that new address saying, we understand you've registered there, gives that person a chance to clarify. If they say, no, I'm only here for the school term, or I'm only here for whatever, then we don't purge their name. But we've been able to clean that voter database up, and it's helped a lot. And that's called cross-check. And the General Assembly is approving it with the kind of regulations that we need to make sure it's not abused at all. So that's the second one. And without reaching for my papers, I can tell you about a third one that I'm interested in, and that is vote centers. And this is on primary day. We've had
I heard about those, yes. Okay.
Very, very low turnout on primary day for all kinds of reasons, because primary is by party, and some parties are more energetic than others, and so that affects turnout. We've had precincts, David, where all day long, where you have 3 people manning the precinct, because that's required by code, and 1 voter shows up. So much for confidentiality, because you know that person voted, but you have 1 vote all day when you're open from, from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. Vote centers would cluster precincts in convenient locations around the state. For instance, one of the more populated counties wants to pilot that and put 14 vote centers around the county where you could go to any one of those 14. You would not have to go to a specific one, because the database would all be the same in all 14. And it would be convenient for the voter to be able to do that on a primary election day with the turnout is typically very, very low. And a lot of cost savings, because you would not have to man all of those precincts on that day. That is one that it's very dear to my heart as well, simply because of the cost savings. And in other states where they've done this, they've increased voter turnout because of the convenience.
I happened to be watching in the Senate when Senator Creed Deeds had a pilot program for a locality that's very small. You talked about a very large one, but he was talking about, I think, about Bath County.
Yes.
And he said they would like to do a pilot there. So,
well, the legislation that's pending and making its way through the General Assembly is to pilot.
Yes.
It has a sunset date, so that at the end of that period, is this the thing we should keep doing or not? And I think that would be a smart thing to do. What really interests me, of course, the cost savings. But if you can do things like this to increase voter participation, we should be doing those things.
Yes. Yeah. Is there another one you want to name? We have another minute or so that you'd like to mention.
I have to reach for my papers, which fell on the floor again. I apologize for that. The bipartisan redistricting commission that's been proposed the last few sessions every time. For some reason, there's some reluctance for the General Assembly to do that. But what that would do would be create a bipartisan commission whose responsibility would be to draw the district lines for congressional districts as well as the House and Senate, Virginia House and Virginia Senate. That makes a lot of sense. That's something that the approach that I've heard lately would be to create a referendum. Ask the voters, would you rather see a commission draw the boundaries or keep it the way it is, and see how the voters feel about that. We might be pleasantly surprised where the voters would say, no, we like it the way it is, or we might see, no, I think it's time to have that bipartisanship. And we've heard a lot every cycle, every 10 years, when the census creates a new map, or as a result of the census, we create a new map. We've seen how creative they get with how those districts look. Their software has been developed to create these districts, but that software does not take into account splitting precincts. And every time you split a precinct, you add another $25,000 worth of equipment you have to buy, because you have to have dual setup in that. So I think a bipartisan commission could be cognizant of that as they drew the districts, as well as community and those common entries. So I think each session it gets a little more popular than the session before.
Yes. Charles Judd, thank you very much for your service to the Commonwealth, and thank you for updating our viewers on these issues.
Thank you, David.
Forward to talking to you again.
It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome Dr. John McGlennon, Professor McGlennon, Supervisor McGlennon. You got many different hats that you wear, but to This Week in Richmond. But also among those many hats is a chair of a coalition of high growth communities. So we're interested in having you tell our viewers about some of the growth issues that are impacting James City County, your county, and other counties and cities, and and any other local government issues you'd like to mention during the time here, that issues that are before the General Assembly. So
Right.
what news can you bring them today?
Well, thanks, David. Let me just say a word or two about the Coalition for High Growth Communities, since I do serve as chair of that organization. We got together about 16 years ago in Fredericksburg to address the concern that a lot of localities had in Virginia, that they were experiencing very rapid rates of growth and didn't really have the tools necessary to adjust to that growth. There were a lot of new pressures being put on infrastructure, accommodating new services like additional schools, increased public safety and recreational and library facilities and so forth. So we decided at that time that we needed to have an organization that didn't just speak for counties or cities as a group, but focus specifically on the concerns that areas that were growing rapidly would have. We've, over the years, had membership from about 18 to 25 localities, and they are all over the state, but especially concentrated in Northern Virginia, Central Virginia, and Hampton Roads. Currently, we're going through a period in which, as we've been coming out of the economic recession, the rate of growth hasn't been as great in some of these traditionally fast-growing areas, but we're starting to see that activity pick up again. And again, the concern that we have is that we're able to plan adequately so that our communities can retain the very factors that make them so attractive to people who want to come into the area. That means we need a little bit more flexibility in terms of how we regulate land use, some assistance in terms of finding the money that will pay for new school buildings, parks and recreation facilities, roads and the like. And so we're very concerned about making sure that as the General Assembly thinks about land use issues, that they take into account the needs of these fast-growing communities and the taxpayers who live there.
You know, I imagine most of our viewers know that local governments have to come somewhat hat in hand to the General Assembly, since the General Assembly does make those decisions. And probably some of our viewers are in areas where they said, wish we had more growth. Mm-hmm. And others are in places where the growth is just putting a taxing burden on the localities.
That's right. And one of the things that sometimes surprises people is to think that local government really doesn't have a stronger voice in the decisions that are made in Richmond. Unlike a lot of other interests that have paid lobbyists who come up on a regular basis, many local governments don't have a paid staff to do that and can only keep track of what's going on in Richmond on a case-by-case basis. So we have to rely on our two large organizations, the Virginia Municipal League, which largely represents cities and towns, and the Virginia Association of Counties, which represents counties. In both cases, they're not precisely focused on necessarily just the issues that are of concern to high growth communities. And so that's what caused this organization to begin. It is important for us to get a message across to our legislators so that they know that in their efforts to promote economic development and growth, which I think everybody applauds, they do have to also recognize that this growth does take a toll on the local communities in which it occurs, and sometimes the local taxpayers who are already there very reasonably ask the question of, well, why are we paying for the folks who are coming into our community and putting more stress on the community, as opposed to why don't they pay a larger share of that cost?
I don't know the figures, but I've heard about how frequently a new school has to be built in Fairfax or Loudon and mm-hmm. those areas where the growth has been so tremendous, and with the costs falling so much on local government, on local taxpayers.
Well, that's right, and especially in areas that are relatively affluent, like a Loudoun County or James City County, where the school funding formulas really don't provide as much assistance from the state government as they would, reasonably enough, in places that are not as wealthy. But the problem that we confront is simply that so much has to be done so quickly. As you mentioned, there are places, Loudoun's a great example of this. In fact, as one of the fastest growing counties in the nation for a long time, Loudoun was looking at building a school or more a year. And that's a burden that most rural counties would never experience. even today, for a lot of communities, the question is really more of, do we close down another facility as opposed to having to build a new state-of-the-art facility that's going to be expected by parents who are moving into residential communities where they've chosen to move into these areas because of the quality of the schools and other public services.
Now, you teach political science at the College,
I do.
College of William & Mary. Do you get into local government issues at times there?
Absolutely. You know, it's funny that sometimes my students will come into class on the day after we've had a meeting and tell me they were watching me on television last night.
So the Board of Supervisors is on TV.
It's broadcast on our local television stations, and it's also available on demand. I don't think too many of my students go and watch it on demand, but they will ask questions about it. And I have to admit that every once in a while, for a couple of minutes at a class, if we've had a particularly vexing meeting, I may come in and vent for 2 or 3 minutes before we get on to the topic for the day.
Right.
But usually with an effort to try to explain the nature and operation of local government.
You know, we're having this conversation on what's really kind of a local government county day here at the General Assembly. And in addition to counties that aren't experiencing that much growth, some that are high growth, then there's also the rural caucus that meets that because so many of the counties, I guess, are being stressed because of a lack of jobs.
That's right, and that's the important thing about local government, is that one size never fits all. And in fact, you can't even assume that an area that has experienced a particular trend will continue to see that trend. We've seen some high growth communities suddenly become flat in their development patterns and in their population increases. On the other hand, for decades we were watching our central cities decline in population, and now they're among the fastest growing areas of the state. And I think we really do have to think creatively about the ways in which we can take advantage of that, the fact that people want to move back into more densely populated areas and where there's already excess capacity for some public services, and work with those central cities and the surrounding suburbs to more efficiently utilize the resources that we have at hand and perhaps save a little bit in terms of having to put up new infrastructure.
You know, here in Central Virginia, there's probably good examples of both. And in the media, just in the last few days, there was information about a school closing in the city of Richmond at the same time that Henrico County reached a new peak in the number of students in the public school system. And so while one was looking at older facilities and vacant seats in middle schools and so forth, and the other's looking at bursting at the seams and having, I guess I'd call them trailers or some kind of mobile units because of the overflow.
Learning cottages is a term that's often used.
Yes.
But the fact is that our system of local government is one that isn't always as rational as we might like. People settle themselves where they want to, where they feel they can get the best opportunities. And that means sometimes that you'll have a city or county that has excess capacity right next to one which is in high demand and where there's a need to build more. These days, with the stress on public funds, there really has been a lot of discussion about ways in which cities and counties can work across their boundary lines, but that's always a challenge because people want to feel that they have control over their locality. And when they start to see that kind of regional development, recognizing that it has great assets, you also do run into a lot of pushback from folks who say, we didn't move here to share our resources with somebody else, or how do we know that we'll still be able to benefit from the money that we're putting forward? So it's a challenge.
So if you go down to the local level where they say all politics is local, what sort of issues do you most hear about from constituents in your high growth county?
In my county, where we still have a fairly strong rural atmosphere, people are very concerned about the protection of farmland and forests. They say that they didn't come to James City County to experience an increasing urbanization, but of course the fact that they're coming is in and of itself making the area more densely populated and more urban. And so we've got to plan very carefully about how we do protect that small town feel while accommodating an increasing number of people. It's a real challenge, and sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. We've done some very innovative things in terms of purchase of development rights programs, purchase of conservation easements, protection of green space in historically significant areas. I think one of my proudest accomplishments was getting a permanent conservation easement placed on Mainland Farm, which was the first farmland that was farmed by English settlers in the New World.
Well, it's obviously a challenge, and we very much appreciate your being on This Week in Richmond to help our viewers, because some of them are in high growth areas and they're glad to hear a voice. And some of them are saying, you know, bring the growth onto them, but it's not that uniform throughout the Commonwealth. But thank you very much, John McGlennon, Supervisor and Professor.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com.
Alpha Natural Resources, a leader in mine safety and an environmental steward.
Haley Buick GMC in Richmond and online at haleybuickgmc.com. Intelligent Illuminations, helping you manage, monitor, and control your streetlights. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community.
The Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.